So I'm really kind of just getting back started on this and wanted to test some things out. I have noise. I'm gonna warn you right now. I have noise in the background, so that's okay because it's more of a testing type episode tonight anyway. But I figured that perhaps a good topic to talk about while doing this test live stream is one pertaining to triggers. Um, Triggers seem to be one of those topics that there's a lot of misperception surrounding the topic of triggers. You'll hear a lot of people. You'll get a lot of people that say, "Well, she's being triggered. He's just being triggered," um, and they'll call everything a trigger, right? And I used to have some issues with this too. I knew that I had been traumatized by a variety of things. Um, Sexual assault by a medic, uh, abusive relationship. And so, but I wasn't quite sure what it meant to be triggered, right? So every time something happened and I thought, well, I'm overreacting because I'm just being triggered, was my mindset and my thought at the time. So I actually had to take some time, and as I was going through counseling, I was mentioning to my counselor how difficult it was for me to kind of determine or ascertain whether something was like a trigger or if it was actually an intuition or if it was actually something that was warranted me feeling the way that I was feeling. And I would describe some scenarios to her, and she was like, "Oh, well, those aren't really triggers. I mean, that's something that's really happening. So that's not a trigger." So what I started to do is I kind of started to look at, do some more research on triggers and what triggers could mean and what triggers entail. And um, one of the very first things that I discovered, which you would think would be common sense, but it's not to everyone, is that everyone's triggers are different, and people are going to react differently to their triggers depending on the trauma that caused the trigger. So when we're thinking about triggers, I think it's good to talk about the definition of triggers. So when we talk about triggers, triggers are we call them mental triggers or psychological triggers. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about dealing with trauma or even substance abuse. These are mental or psychological triggers, and this can be any type of stimuli, internal or external, that causes an intense emotional response from a person. And that intense emotional response can be a host of things. It could be rapid heart rate, sweating. Some people get nauseous. Some people vomit. Um, some people suffer really strange phenomena in their body. Their body reacts in a way that they don't intend it to react. Don't intend to react. So there's a lot of different ways in which a person may react to a trigger. But what's most important is that many times when people are triggered, they don't know what's causing them to be triggered. So triggers aren't always obvious. Someone can just walk in a room and be triggered and not have a clue as to why they're feeling this intense emotional distress all of a sudden. Trigger can come from smells, being in crowded places, being around a certain person that reminds you of an event. So it can be all those things that can cause someone to be triggered, right? Triggers are very real. They're not just someone being too sensitive or oversensitive or someone that's being insecure. It's none of that. Triggers are a real psychological event that happens within a person, and they're caused by real psychological traumatic things that have happened to them in the past. So a trigger is always going to remind someone or take someone back and make them feel like they're right back in the position that caused them the trigger in the first place. So someone who was maybe raped or someone who was abused, that trigger, when they're triggered, it takes them right back to that situation as though they're in that situation currently. So that's what a trigger is. Um, and it's misleading for a lot of people to think that, again, these triggers are just for people who are just oversensitive about different things, or people who are just overreacting to things. That's not what a trigger is at all. Totally not. Um, so a lot of times we question, are we being triggered, or or is this our intuition, right? So sometimes when a person has gone through a situation that has caused them a lot of trauma, psychological trauma, and they're dealing with trying to normalize their life, they will encounter situations. For example, if you've been in an abusive relationship and you're going into or trying to be in a healthy relationship, one of the issues within a healthy relationship is that there may be certain things that happen that you don't know whether you're actually being triggered or if it's something else. Okay. So what has happened is that some people tend to take advantage of this too, right? So you may be in a relationship with someone, and they may do something, and if you respond to it in a certain way, if they know your past, they may easily throw up, oh, well, you're just being triggered, and kind of brush it off. So when we talk about these type of things, I talk about triggers when we're talking about situations and relationships. I guess the best way to explain this if a person had been raped in the past, and they're walking down the street, and uh, every time they encounter maybe like a man, they were raped by a man, or they were raped by a woman, and every time they encounter someone like that, they're triggered, right? And they feel this intense emotional response. That's a trigger. If a person is walking down the street and they're actually attacked and someone tries to rape them, that's not a trigger. That's something that's actually happening to them. Okay. And I say this to say to come to this point. A lot of times when we're in relationships, especially when we're trying to be in what we think is a healthy relationship, or when we still trying to heal from an abusive relationship and we enter another one, we'll encounter people who do things, and we'll question, are they really doing something, or are we being triggered? And people will take advantage of that. If you bring it up to attention again, they'll say like, well, you're just being overly sensitive. So for example, if you were in an abusive relationship, or if you were just in a relationship where that was a bad experience because the person was, taking you through hell, but maybe it didn't go to the level of actual, emotional or physical abuse, or you don't think it was that level, but the person was just doing things, and you found out that they were cheating on you because um, uh, they would do certain things with their phone, right? So they would start off turning their phone over um, when you were around them, or if they're on their phone and they would quickly switch to a different page or shut the screen off when you came in the room. That person always did those things, and then later on you find out they were cheating. So now you're in a new relationship. And while you're in a new relationship, the person that you're with is doing the same thing, turning the phone over. Every time you enter a room, they're flicking off the screen, or going to a different page, or turning off the screen, or they're sending text messages to someone quickly before they get in the car. And you may think, oh, well, if that gives you pause, you may think, oh, well, I'm just being triggered because this is what happened in the last relationship. In reality, this is not what we would call an actual trigger. This is something that the person is actually doing, right? That seems shady to anyone, to someone who hasn't even been in an abusive relationship, or to someone who hasn't gone through any type of trauma, would find those things strange. So if a person is lying to you and you can tell that they're lying to you, yes, that's what they're doing. You're not just being triggered. They are actually lying to you about something, and you need to have a conversation with them about why they're lying to you. Or if a person is, every time they go to a certain place, they're not answering their phone, that's not you just being triggered. That is something that they're actually doing. So there's a difference. There's a difference between smelling something, smelling a cologne on a person, and that triggering you, and a person actually doing something that reminds you, or that is the exact same thing that someone else did to you. Okay, so that is not a trigger. And if you wanted to call it a trigger, is a valid trigger, okay? And we can call them valid trigger. Is something that's valid. There's some validity to it. And you may need to ask a question about why are you doing these things when I'm in the room. So it's very important to understand that, especially when you're trying to, again, recover from whatever traumatic experience you've had, especially when you're trying to enter into a healthier relationship. That's very important to understand that. It's also very important to communicate to people and to your partners, for example, uh, your triggers. And sometimes you like, again, we don't always know what's triggering us, but when they happen, is a good thing to communicate that, hey, when we were at this restaurant, or when we went to this place, or when I smelled this, I felt like this way, or when you did this, it made me feel like this. Because communicating is very important to help your partner understand. A lot of times there are things that your partner can avoid doing, those things that they're not not intentionally doing, but there are some things that they can avoid doing to cause so that you won't be triggered by certain actions or by certain smells. And again, communication helps with understanding, and it's important because sometimes your partner may not ever be able to stop you from being triggered in certain situations, and that's not their job. But it's important for them to understand that if you are triggered, okay, this is what happened, this is why they're feeling this way, and this is something that's very real, and it's something that they can't control. um, that aspect is very important because, again, some people have the misperception that a trigger can be controlled, and it can't be controlled. A person's response to a trigger is not something that they can always control. What we can do, those of us who have triggers and who have um, been going through counseling, is that we do have techniques that will help to calm us down when we encounter these triggers. We have techniques that help us to figure out what it was exactly that triggered us. So we have all those things that we use that we can call tools, but at the same time, it takes understanding from other people too to understand what you're going through, and you have to communicate that to them. At no time should anyone be embarrassed that they have triggers. At no time should anyone be made to feel less than because they have triggers. At no time should anyone be made to feel like they're being overly sensitive or too sensitive because they have triggers. And at no time should a person be gaslighted into believing that they are just being triggered when someone is actually doing some bullshit. Period. Okay. Um, so we want to make sure that if we feel that someone is actually doing something, and our intuition and our gut is telling us, no, this is what they did, that's not a trigger. And it's okay to question that. And if you question that and a person makes you feel like shit for questioning that, you need to rethink whether or not need to be in the presence of that person. There's so much that can be said about triggers. And again, the research and the studies that have been conducted on triggers is broad. There's a wealth of information out there. I encourage everyone to go and learn about triggers. Those who have them, those who don't. You may know someone who have them, or you may be around someone that maybe responds in a way and you think it's maybe strange, and maybe that's what they're dealing with. So I encourage you to go and try to understand some of these things that people who have been traumatized, and that's not just talking, again, that's not just talking about abuse, that's talking about people who are suffering from PTSD, those who have been abused physically, those who have been abused emotionally, those who have been abused as a child. There are those who have witnessed things that have been traumatic to them. So there's just a string of things that could have happened to someone that could cause them to be traumatized. And so it's just really important to try to understand what those triggers are and where they come from. And for my test again tonight, I just thought it was very important to kind of talk about that subject because I hear it a lot when people are, especially when people are entering in new relationships and they keep saying that a person is just seeing they're overly sensitive. And really, I'm thinking in my head, like, no, that person is just BSing you and gaslighting you into thinking that your abuse from your other relationship is causing you to destroy your current relationship. So I hope you enjoyed my little session on triggers, and I hope to start doing these sessions more often and doing these live feeds more often, and bringing up topics that are beneficial for those of us who have dealt with abusive relationships. So have a good night.